Hello friends. For today's video, I wanted to go through a list of things that I do to keep myself from falling into reading slumps. This was actually prompted by one of you who had asked about reading slumps in the comments of a recent video, and I figured I would make this video, one, to elaborate on that topic, but also because I figured maybe some of these things could be really helpful to all of you. Before I jump into it, I do want to say that I do think sometimes there is this, I see other people reading so many books, so I have to try to keep up. It's hard not to play the comparison game, but really, if you have a lot of stress in your life, don't worry about reading just to say you're reading. You will be able to get to it when you can. But if you are just sort of like, I just want to know some general tips to prevent reading slumps because there's so many books and so little time, and I want to read as many books in this lifetime as possible, then hopefully some of these tips will help. Jumping into it, the first point is that I do not read every day. And I really want to emphasize that I do not read every day, because I think so often you hear that people, when they're encouraging you to read, how to make reading a habit, how to make reading part of your life, they will tell you read every day, bring a book with you everywhere you go, read every second you can. If you have 5 minutes, pick up your book. And I'm not by any means trying to say that that's not good advice, especially if you are trying to make it a habit and it's not one currently. But I really wanted to have this be the first point, not because I'm trying to discredit what other people have said or say, no, my way is the right way, do what I do, but rather different things work for different people. And this is why, honestly, self-help books I have the hardest time with, because I'll read something and I'll be like, yeah, but that doesn't work for everybody. And then even though that's probably implied, when they don't outright state that, then I'm like, well, now I can't take you seriously because you're acting as though you're the authority on this, but you're forgetting all these other people that this doesn't work for. But I don't want to fall into that and by any means try and act as though the idea of not reading every day is going to work for everybody. It works for me because I have found with most things, I just am the most productive. I get the most out of it. And with reading specifically, I retain the information the best. I get the most out of the story. I enjoy it. The emotional parts hit really hard, all those things. I experience the story the best when I dedicate a lot of time to just sinking into that and being in that. This is not going to even be possible for everybody because some people, you just have so much going on in your life right now that maybe you really only do have 15, 20 minutes a day to pick up a book, which if that's the case, that is completely fine. There's going to be a ton of other points to talk about to keep from getting into a reading slump. So you're just going to have to obviously assess what your situation is like. But I have always been a devourer. I do not like having things in bits and pieces. If I'm going to draw, which is a thing I enjoy doing, it's a hobby of mine, I'm not great at it, but if I'm going to sit and draw, I want to draw for hours. If I'm going to play video games, I usually want to play for at least an hour. If I'm going to do a puzzle, I want to finish the puzzle that day. I just always want to do things as much as possible. I enjoy my reading experience when I'm not taking little tiny bites out of the story, but rather I'm consuming it as much as possible, either in its entirety or I'm getting the most out of it as I can. Again, this isn't going to work for everybody. There's plenty of reasons why you might want to make reading a daily habit. And part of why making it a daily habit can be so helpful for so many people is that reading maybe just isn't a part of your life. Maybe you're getting into reading as an adult. Maybe you're a parent and you spent so much time doing so much for your kids and you're trying to find time to do something for you. But the first thing that goes is the thing that's not a consistent part of your life. And if that's reading in this case, then it's going to fall off pretty quickly. So if you find ways to make it a part of your everyday, it can be really helpful. I just find for myself, the best comparison I can make is if I go to watch a movie, I want to sit and watch that movie. I don't want to watch 5 minutes of a scene and then pick up the next day and watch another 5 minutes. That just doesn't work for me, and that's kind of how my brain works with books as well. I promise I will get to the other points here in a second, but I just want to add one more thing to this, which is that I'm somebody who has a lot of things that I want to partake in. And I have a lot of interest in a lot of hobbies. And so this is the best way for me to get to experience a lot of those different things. And I know for some people, reading is their favorite thing in the world, or it's one of their absolute favorite things in the world. And so they don't really need to worry about dedicating time to other things. But for me, I just find that I have the best time with all of these different activities, and I allow myself to experience different things when I don't feel the need to fill every single day's spare time with reading. The next point is that I switch between different subgenres, and occasionally I do switch between different genres. So this also ties a little bit into mood reading as well. It's like a form of mood reading, but with the subgenres specifically, because many of you know I primarily read fantasy, which is pretty clear by just looking at the books behind me. But I do tend to dip my toes in different subgenres of fantasy. So if I just read an epic fantasy, next up I might pick up a cozy fantasy. Or if I just read something that is leaning toward or is considered fantasy romance, the next thing I read might be a political standalone fantasy, that kind of thing. So I bounce between different subgenres. If one of them's more historical, the next one might be more sci fantasy. Then, occasionally, I'll just completely abandon fantasy and dip my toes elsewhere. This allows me to come back to my one true love, which is fantasy, with kind of fresh eyes, and also it allows me to appreciate the artistry that goes into writing a story in a different genre. It really showcases the strengths of that genre, so when I come back to fantasy as a reviewer, I feel it strengthens my ability to assess the story, assess the pacing, the story beats, the character arcs. I feel like I can look at things with a fuller view of the art of crafting a story, but at the same time, it gives me some time to miss fantasy, so I come back excited about it. And by switching between subgenres a lot, I never really get bored. I think part of what can happen with reading slumps is there are books where we love them, and we're like, I want more of this, and so we start to find more books like that, but what you end up doing is you're just reading the same subgenre all the time, and things start to feel too similar, and then you get kind of fatigued of that. And if you just maybe tried something a tiny bit different, doesn't have to be totally different, but just a tiny bit, then it reawakens that love for you'll have time to miss it, right? The heart grows fonder. And then again, I know some people are extreme mood readers, and so by switching between things, it allows for those different moods to be met. And also, if you're somebody who likes to read seasonally, I think that there are a lot of subgenres that fit within seasonal recommendations as well. I think a big one for a lot of people is in the fall and the winter. There's certain books they associate with that time of year. But even then, you can break it down into witchy books. You can break it down into horror, fantasy horror. You can have some thriller stories mixed in there. You could have things with more folklore elements that are more tied to the environment because, oh yeah, it's just like outside, the leaves are changing. And so it allows you to have some of that mood reading, but once again, it doesn't feel like you're reading the same thing over and over and over again. A similar point, this next one, is that I try to vary the lengths of the stories that I'm reading. And this is pretty self-explanatory. If I just picked up a book that was 700 pages, then I'm probably looking to pick up something that's more of a novella, or maybe it's not a novella, but it's a little on the shorter side, or it's not actually shorter, but it's a lot easier to get through because the writing is a lot more inviting, that sort of a thing. If I'm going to read something that's dense, it might be shorter than something that is not as dense, but it allows for my brain to be challenged at times, and then for it to sink more into like the enjoyment and entertainment factor, and it kind of rotates between those things. I think sometimes in talking about works that are challenging versus works that are more entertainment focused, that we can view these things as a binary. It's either one or the other, when more often than not, a lot of works fall somewhere in between, and there is sort of an overlap between the two. And I find that for me, there are certain books that lean more toward the challenging side, or they're more thematically driven, they're more serious, and then there are ones that are a lot more fun. So even though I'm specifically having this be categorized under length, sometimes it's more of like the length of time I need to spend reading something. We all know that a paragraph of one author's works and a paragraph of another author's works are not necessarily equal when it comes to the effort our brains are putting into it. So it's not just page length, but also the length of time that it takes you to read something. Next up, we have immersion reading. This absolutely took me so long to get into. I thought it was the stupidest thing for a long time. Not that I thought people who utilized immersion reading were stupid, but I just always am like, it doesn't work for me. I think this is weird. Why do I need somebody to read a story to me as I am reading it? If you don't know what immersion reading is, I just kind of described it, but the idea is that you are reading a physical copy or a digital copy. You're reading some kind of copy in front of you with your eyes while listening to the audiobook. And for a long time, I just thought that was completely unnecessary. However, I now find that this is a great way for me to be really immersed in the story. It allows multiple senses to be locked into the story, and thus it allows me to focus in a little bit stronger than I would otherwise. If you've never tried immersion reading, or maybe you've only tried it a little bit, you likely will need to give it a few attempts, and sometimes it comes down to the narrator, the speed of the narration versus the speed at which you read. So there are other factors that go into getting into immersion reading, but just know the very first time you do it, like me, you're probably going to want to abandon it pretty quickly. It might take some time to get into, and at the end of the day, just like I was saying with the first point, it might not end up working for you at all, but if you've never tried it before, it could be something that really helps you. Not every single point from here on out is going to be audiobook oriented, but the next one I thought it would make sense to couple it with the previous point, which is that I do listen to audiobooks, and if it is a book that I can just listen to on audio, because I often, for the more epic or intense type of stories, I will do immersion reading, but if it's something that you can just listen to, a contemporary romance or a cozy fantasy, something like that, I find that what is really fun for me is I have certain household tasks, as most people do. You know, you have putting the dishes away, vacuuming, doing the laundry, things that are absolutely mindless, that we could be occupying our imagination and our mind and our ears if we were to also be listening to an audiobook. And I find that if I just put on some kind of athletic shoe, if I put those shoes on and I put my headphones on and then I go make a to-do list, turn the audiobook on, and I can listen to that audiobook for hours. And it ends up making me want to find other things to do around the house. So oftentimes there will be a Saturday or a Sunday where I get so much cleaning done because I'll dust off my bookshelves, I'll do all the other tasks I mentioned, I'll start organizing some drawers, something where I'm like I'm really not using my brain even a little bit, watering the plants outside because I have a lot of plants. And in doing that, by combining these two things together, these two being, you know, maybe something relatively boring and mindless with a fantastic story, when you blend those two, it kind of enhances the experience overall because you're getting stuff done, which makes me happy. I'm sure it makes a lot of you happy to get stuff done as well. And you're listening to a story, and it makes it more fun. And by the end of it, if you finish the story and you do a bunch of stuff around the house, you just feel doubly productive. The next point's actually going to be something I do not do, which is that I do not listen to audiobooks while exercising. I know for some people, a daily walk with an audiobook or being on the treadmill, going for a run, doing those things while listening to an audiobook can be really helpful. For me, if I'm trying to work out, I'm too occupied in, okay, you know what, I'm going to raise the incline, or I think I can run a little bit more, those sorts of things. Or if I'm on a walk, I'm kind of like, who's this person that's really close to me? You still want to be aware of your surroundings. I find I just need, usually, music. I do not like listening to audiobooks. I want something that pumps me up. I want something that makes me want to go. And listening to audiobooks, it doesn't do that for me. My brain's already too engaged in the workout or the physical activity, and thus I can't focus on the story if I am listening to one while doing that as well. So if you're somebody who you've tried, you're like, well, I know I consistently go to the gym, why don't I tie these two things together? I have found it doesn't really work for me. And in fact, it makes me lose focus on the story. And then I feel like I have to go back and read it again. And sometimes that can make you feel kind of slumpy. Like, what's wrong with me? Why can't I focus? And sometimes it's just certain tasks are not meant to be tied to reading and listening to audiobooks. Next up, and this is something that has been incredibly helpful over the last couple of years, is that I check things out from the library all the time. I check out physical copies and I check out the audiobooks from the library. And part of why this is so helpful is I think it taps into this idea that most people, there is a certain perfect balance of amount of time that you have to do a task versus being on a deadline. So for some people, if you give them too little time, they will get really overwhelmed. They won't do as good of a job. They'll feel really stressed. And then there is, if you give people too much time, they procrastinate, then they cram, they waste time. And if there's this perfect amount, then they're able to get what they need to get done, and they end up doing a better job. They're more focused. There's like this perfect sweet spot. And for me, there's something about checking things out from the library that when I see that number of, okay, this is going to be due by this date, I'm like, oh, okay, well, I got to read it. And something about that helps me ensure that I'm always kind of getting through things. It does make it a little difficult as a planner because sometimes certain things will come in from the library when I'm not expecting them to. So that's one downside to this, but I also find that if I'm checking something out from the library and I know that there are people waiting, it does encourage me to get to it so that those other people can get access to that story as soon as possible. And part of why I wanted to specifically emphasize that perfect sweet spot is I find sometimes I love my local bookstores. I have bought many a book from them using store credit. So in a way, it's similar to the library and then I'm not actually spending money. However, there's something about if a book is just sitting on my shelf and it's there for whenever I finally get around to it. There's something about that does not push me to pick it up as quickly as something that I got from the library, and I only have so much time before I have to take it back. So if you are somebody that loves to pick up books that you haven't actually read yet, just know that sometimes there's something about it always being available that makes you less likely to pick it up, whereas if you know it's not available for an infinite amount of time, then you might feel that want to get around to it sooner. This next one is actually kind of 2 points in one, and both are pretty self-explanatory. I like to alternate between new releases and older works, and similarly, I like to alternate between popular works and underhyped works. So part of what helps me a lot, I mentioned before, is that variety in length, variety in the amount of effort my brain has to put into reading something, switching between subgenres, switching between genres. This falls under a similar umbrella. Part of what's nice about going between popular and underhyped is obviously so many of us, if we pick up something popular, it's just so fun to be a part of the conversation. It's so fun to engage with other people. However, there's downsides to that too. If you're always picking up the popular things, sometimes it can feel as though you can't have an original thought. You can't say anything without somebody telling you, no. Well, at one time the author said at this one convention that they found, and then you're like, okay, but can I just have my own thoughts and feelings about this book without everybody having to say something? So even though fandoms are great, even though it's wonderful to be able to make something that is typically a rather isolated hobby into something more social, while that's wonderful, it can have its downsides. And if you're constantly having to engage in everybody else's opinions, you kind of lose out on that personal connection to stories. So sometimes it's nice to just disconnect. Maybe don't worry about making it a part of your reading, talking to other people. But with popular books, even if you shut it off, even if you don't look at anybody else's thoughts, it's hard to have not at least somehow heard things before. So sometimes by picking up the underhyped, hidden gems, lesser known works, you can just be like, I don't know anything about this. And you can replicate that feeling of being a kid and walking into the library and just looking at something's cover and being like, I'm going to give this a try, or looking at the synopsis and being like, that sounds good, and then giving it a go. And when it ends up being something you love, it's just the best. There's something about, I think, hidden gems that just take you, like, blow you away, that's just like this really special feeling that sometimes, reading the popular works just can't quite tap into. However, obviously in doing this, you miss out on having a part in the conversation. So I think that going back and forth between the two is really, really helpful. It allows you to have that fulfillment individually, and on the other end, it allows you to engage with others. On top of that, though, if you are a reviewer yourself, or you're somebody who has friends that really like to read, you like to have conversations about books, if you find a hidden gem, you're not going to shut up about it. And then it's fun because you're like, no, you should read this. And if your friend, sometimes you end up rereading the book because your friend's like, okay, I'll read it. And then so you're like, okay, I'll do a reread. And sometimes that can help you stay motivated to read. It can help you from falling into a slump. And then on the other end, going back and forth between the new and the older, there's a lot that falls into the same things that I was just discussing. If it's older, chances are there's a lot of people that have already had opinions about it. There's the inability to theorize, depending on if the series is completed or not. But if it's an older work, it's kind of you get to see the inspiration behind a lot of things. You get to finally understand why something was so well loved by so many people. And then if you're picking up newer things, it's fresh. You're coming to it without anybody else's input. And sometimes it's just fun to try to hop onto a new bandwagon and see also the direction. I'm somebody who likes to assess trends. I like to see where things are going or predict where things are going. And by reading newer works, it's kind of fun to try and see the direction that a genre is going in, or see a direction that it seems like a certain trend is going in. Is something here to say, or is it going to go? The next point is that I consume a lot of stories via different mediums. I obviously love novels. However, I also love manga. I also love anime. I love something where in its original form, it is a show. I love a great video game. Oh, it's the best. It's the best. And so by allowing myself to engage in stories that are told in different ways, it allows the imagination, I feel, to be almost expanded, and you get to tap into different things that we look for in stories. In books, you are the sole creator of making that story come to life off of the page, right? Everything, you visualize everything in your mind if you have that ability. Some people actually don't, which I always think, what is reading like for you? That's really interesting. But that's a side tangent regardless. When you are reading, you're the one that's visualizing. You're the one that's hearing things in your mind. You're the one that all the feelings are just within you. There's nothing influencing you except for those words. However, when you watch a show, you have the mix of now you're hearing things. You're hearing not just the voices, the sound effects, the music. The amount that music can really influence you is a really important part of stories that are in different mediums. But if you're looking at something that is a manga, you're seeing the things that you would not otherwise see, and also the way in which amazing artists can depict things with paneling, with the different art styles, with different shades of gray. It just taps into something different. And again, I feel like there's not really any one medium that's better than the other. There's just different ways for stories to be told. And I like to imagine that we have all this space, that books kind of fill this over here, and then music within, because music is a form of storytelling too, but music within shows, that can fill something over here. The art in a great manga and great comics can fill something over here. So it just feels like you're allowing everything to be filled. And I think sometimes what can happen is if you're only really engaging in stories within books, you're filling one thing a lot. And then sometimes all of this over here is somewhat neglected. And if we just started to fill this up a little bit, this would be ready to get refilled again. So I think that by going between them, it allows for you to just enjoy stories in so many different forms. The next point is a very practical, simple one, but I put my books that I'm planning to read or that I am reading where I can see them. And this is obviously specifically for physical copies, but some people get TBR carts. Some people will put things on their nightstand. Wherever you know you are going to see something every single day, try putting the books that you're wanting to read, maybe a little stack of them so that you can choose between them. Try putting them where you know you're going to see them. Because just like with food, if there's a certain food item that you enjoy, but you're like, I want this to be something I indulge in here and there, I don't want to eat this every single day. If it's just sitting on your kitchen counter, every time you see it, you're going to be like, well, maybe I'll just have a little. Whereas if it's not even in your house, you can't even do that. You'll be so occupied with other things going on in your life that you won't remember that you want it until you actually have that craving for it. And it's kind of like that same concept. If your books are just off somewhere to the side, they're in a bookshelf, they're in another room that you don't go in as often, or maybe you don't check them out from the library until you decide, like, I think I want to read this. But rather, if you're thinking ahead and you put things where you're going to see them, every time you see that book, you're going to be like, oh yeah, I wanted to read that. And I find that this is extremely helpful. If you are currently experiencing a reading slump, this might be helpful. It also might make you feel really bad though. So just be mindful of what's going on in your life that's causing you to have a reading slump, because what you don't want to do is feel bad about yourself every time you see those books if you have so many other things that are more important that you need your time and attention focused on. So this is more so if that's not your situation and you just genuinely are like, why do I always kind of just have reading slip my mind? How come I'm in a slump? Just put the things that sound good in front of you where you can see them, have those reminders, and you'll see how I find how much more often when you see it, you're like, oh yeah. Next up, I do partake in buddy reads and read-alongs sometimes. Emphasis on sometimes. I do think that a lot of people, when they're new to reading, they really want to experience reading with so many other people. It's what leads people to join book clubs, join read-alongs, join readathons, and also starting channels or some kind of online presence dedicated to books. And that's great, that's lovely, but you can end up experiencing burnout. And sometimes the thing you're not actually burned out on is reading. Sometimes it's all those other things. So that's why I do these things sparingly. Yes, I enjoy buddy reads because I adore my friends and we both like reading. And so it's just fun to partake in something that is a shared hobby. But there are times where I don't want to see anybody else's opinions. I don't want to know anybody else's thoughts. I just want to come to a book fresh, not needing to have any bias influencing me whatsoever. In fact, I usually try to stay along those lines. Usually if I'm doing a buddy read, it's for a sequel or it's for something that I already know a little bit about because it is popular, or sometimes it's just for rereads. And then for read-alongs, usually I'm hosting the read-along, and once again, it's for something I've already read, because I don't want to commit to doing a read along for something that I might end up hating and I might want to DNF. I didn't mention DNFs as their own point on this list because everybody is different when it comes to if you're a completionist or if you're more likely to put things down. But I'm just going to go ahead and add this one in really fast and say sometimes you just need to put a book down. If you're like, every time I even think about reading this book, I'm filled with dread, then stop reading that book. Pick up something else. There are some people that are a little DNF happy, I'll call it. And the second they're even slightly annoyed at something, they're like, I didn't like that. And then they'll put the book down. And you're like, well, maybe the author is doing that intentionally to show that there's a character flaw and that that's going to play a role in their growth later. So DNFs it's so different from person to person. But I do think recognizing when you should or should not DNF something is going to help in the prevention of reading slumps. Last point I want to make, you can utilize this in so many different ways, but it's to write more things down. It doesn't necessarily have to be pen and paper. I do write pretty much everything in notebooks. I don't like an additional digital thing to be right in front of me, so I don't even know how to put things into my phone or my computer calendar. I write things down. And the reason this is helpful is you can use it to write thoughts about your books, and you can use it to keep track of what you want to read, your TBR, what you have read. You can use your writing in that way, but I find a lot of times that I feel unanchored if I don't have some of my thoughts on paper. It just feels like, oh yeah, I can't forget this. I have to remember this. And when you have so many things you have to keep track of, sometimes finding the time to read, you can't really stay focused. When you try to sit and read a book, you have too many things going on in your head. And sometimes if you were just to write those things down, get those things out of your head, then you can finally focus on reading. So it's not the reading itself that's a problem. It's that you have too many things that you're trying to keep track of and you just can't. So write things down. That's it for a list of things that I do to help me keep from falling into a reading slump. Of course, I know I hit this point while talking about individual things, but I want to say this again. Not every single one of these points is going to work for everybody, and sometimes the reverse actually works for you. The important thing is just to recognize that we all come to the table differently. We're all very different people. We all function a little bit differently. And so hopefully there are certain points within this list that you can incorporate into your own life. If you have any of your own suggestions for what you do to stay out of a reading slump, feel free, of course, to add that in the comments. That way anybody comes to this video will see your comments and have even more helpful tips. But thanks so much for watching. I hope you have a great rest of your day, and I'll see you later. Bye.